I really want to thank everyone for joining because this is something that I really love talking about. I've been doing some research in the area for a couple of years now. That was one of the main topics of my dissertation, which I probably ended. I actually wrapped up my dissertation about 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago. So it's still fresh. The thing is, it's always, something we have to be on top of so that we can actually understand what's happening in the scientific community. So we have to be updated. And I'm here for your questions, but before we move on to your questions, I really want to check something with you. So I have a poll set up with Janice and Hedy here so that I just want to realize and really reflect on your background with the science of learning. So I'm launching the poll right now. I'm going to give you some time to answer, and then we can start talking. So you have 2 questions there. They're pretty simple questions. Had you ever heard of the science of learning before the session, and have you ever tried to use anything from the science of learning in your classroom, if you had? Okay. Well, so far, let's see. Most people have actually heard of the science of learning before, which is great. And I think it's 50-50 for the second question, which makes total sense to me, by the way. Yes. So most people have heard of the science of learning, but maybe you didn't know exactly how to use it in your classroom to benefit your students, right? Wonderful. Now I'm going to share my reflective questions with you because they're big questions. I think it's not really easy to answer them, and that's the purpose, right? But still, they will help us determine where you stand with regard to the science of learning. And I'm going to paste the questions here in the chat box. I know you have access to them, but just to make it easier. So there you go. So the very first question I asked was, can neuroscience and psychology knowledge really have a positive impact on learning outcomes? And I'd say yes. I think if you had some time to reflect on that, we have conducted, and when I say we, I'm talking about the scientific community, the researchers, because I feel like we're part of that group, aren't we? We can benefit from science as a whole, as a community. And I think that when they are conducting experiments in their labs and actually working in loco and trying out some strategies, they're really making progress. They're really showing us that there might be better ways, that there might be more effective ways for us to learn. And yes, so I'd say that's definitely a yes. And the next question here is, how can teachers make sure that their students are truly engaged? And I really want someone to help me with this one. So you're free to open your mic and tell me, how do you know if your students are engaged or not? Is it easy to assess that? So who wants to volunteer here, huh? So Maria Josefa Pujol, right? Please, you are definitely, let me just allow you to speak, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always think that you have to make them feel responsible for the learning. And then is when you just start getting them engaged, because you're giving them the responsibility, and also you giving them credit for, I wouldn't say, you give them credit for being capable and able to do it.
That's it.
How I look at it.
Yes, definitely. I think you're on the right track there, Maria. And I think really, if you make them responsible for their own learning process, of course, they're going to be more engaged. But then when you are in the classroom or even, remote teaching, I think it's really hard for you to look at someone and say, I know that they're fully engaged, because maybe they're just pretending. There are different levels of engagement, right? But then we have some tips, some strategies that we might use that are based on the science of learning, and we know what engages the brain. We know how the reward system in the brain works, and we know how we can make students produce more dopamine. And if we base our activities on those principles, then chances are they will be more engaged. And it's the likelihood of being engaged is much higher in that sense, right? Wonderful. And then the next question I asked was, is it possible to estimate how many times students need to revisit the same content before it's consolidated? So you can use your chat box to answer. Do you think you know how many attempts or how many times students have to actually revise things before they have it forever consolidated in their brain cortices? So Gabi says it's impossible to estimate, right? Yeah, so let's see if anybody else has anything to add to this. It's not easy. Each student is different, exactly. Yeah, this is a very important question because it shows us that there is no fixed recipe for learning. And because students have a different genetic makeup and that they were brought up in different environments and they were exposed to different stimuli, you will never really know how many times you can, revisit the same content before you consolidate that. That's why we have to offer different opportunities for students to practice that. And normally, if we look at traditional teaching, especially ELT, we normally just do that in that one lesson that we gave them the input, right? Especially if we are dealing with basic levels, of course, the same contents will kind of appear again now and again after a couple of classes. But when you're working with more advanced students, that vocabulary or grammar structure that you worked with will probably just pop up in lesson 1 and 2, and then you'll never discuss that again, right? So what does that tell us about how many times we're actually giving our students the opportunity to practice? And then the final question I asked you, and I think this is definitely a tough one, how can we avoid the propagation of pseudoscientific ideas about learning? And this one, I think I gave you the answer already. I think you just have to be based on the science of learning and the cognitive sciences. And of course, you have to look at some traditional pedagogical approaches and methods, but then you have to question whether those were validated by what we know now at this point in our, let's say, human evolutionary path. If we have discovered something that actually might go against what we've been doing for centuries or even millennia, right? So I'd say that the best way for us to avoid spreading neuromyths is for us to understand how the brain works, for us to understand how the science of learning can actually contribute to, our in-service, pre-service teacher training courses, so that we avoid saying things that are not really well established in the scientific literature, right? Now I'm going to move on to the questions you have added here in the Q&A box. And of course, I will be checking the chat box as well if you have more questions. And please feel free to open your mics and ask me, or, if you want to ask for clarifications or give examples, that's what we're here for. And the first question.
Andre, before you move on, can I have a question?
Please, yes.
Yes. So, because you are talking about the brain, and you also mentioned the mind from time to time. And my question is related to these two, if they are two. So in the context of the EBC framework that you are talking about, is it important to make a difference between the brain and the mind, or is there a difference between the two? Because people often use them interchangeably.
Yeah, that's a great question, Hedy, and I really think they're very different. The mind is a product of the brain, and the brain is the biological substrate of the mind, and I think we can easily realize that when we think about the fields or the areas that study one and the other, right? If you think about the brain, which area comes to your mind? It's neuroscience, right? So we think about a physiology of and different brain regions and structures. And we think about neurotransmitters, for example, the cortex and subcortical areas. And when we think about the mind, which area comes to your mind? That's psychology, right? So we think about, and we can actually study the mind from different perspectives. We can think of the mind as, the processes that happen in the brain that will have some sort of outcome or output from the mind, like in cognitive psychology. We can also think of the mind as what helps us become, let's say, interactive beings. So we can think of social psychology, for example, how we live together in society. We can also think about how certain things or stages are developed in the mind from a developmental psychology perspective. You can think about special needs, for example, and many times they overlap. So we will look at what the brain offers. So if we want to understand dyslexia, for example, we will definitely look at cognitive neuroscience and look at some of the brain regions that are responsible for reading, processing reading. And so we're going to look at some of the neuronal networks in the left hemisphere of the brain, temporal lobe. We're going to look at Broca's and Wernicke's area, for example. And then we are going to look at the social and cognitive consequences of that in the development of kids in the classroom, for example, the things that they can and they cannot do, and the things they struggle with. So I think the brain and the mind, they are inseparable, but they are two different things. One is the product of the other. And that's why I really like the idea of mind-brain education and the science of learning, because it's transdisciplinary. And this is something I cannot stress enough. If somebody comes to you and says, I have a lot of knowledge, or I have a degree in neuroscience, and then I have come up with a perfect formula for teaching, then the first question you have to ask this person, how many years have you taught in your life, Mr. Neuroscience guy? Because just having a degree in neuroscience doesn't tell you anything really. And that's why we create neuromyths in the first place, because neuroscience cannot always be translated into something practical for the classroom, especially if neuroscience is not talking to education and psychology, right? So I think it's really important for us to understand how we learn from a transdisciplinary perspective, looking at the brain sciences and, of course, at the mind sciences. And again, the mind is definitely a product of, I'd say the brain is the finite portion of, it's an organ that is responsible for many of the functions that we have as humans. And then the mind is sort of infinite in that sense, if you think about it, because it's a projection of what our brain produces, even relates to consciousness, for example, right?
It's like the brain is something that we can touch. However, we cannot really touch the mind.
Yes, that's perfect. That's it. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you for your question. And then, so one of the very first questions here is, can the EBC framework be applied to online teaching? If yes, could you give specific examples about how? I think yes, most definitely, because the EBC framework is really about the learner. It's focused on the learner. It doesn't matter where they're learning. It doesn't matter if they're having face-to-face, in-person classes or online classes, because it's about how the brain engages. It's about how we can build new knowledge. So that has to do with executive functions, for example, for those of you who have studied those, updating the working memory system. And it has to do with how we can make that knowledge available later on in life so that we can use that for whatever we have to do with it, right? And it's really regardless of where and how you are learning. And that's why I think this is very interesting, because the EBC framework, unlike some of the approaches and methods we've been using for quite some time now, really focuses on the fundamentals, really the foundation of learning. And I think that's why it's really easily applicable across different areas. Because, for example, if you think about one of the questions I saw in the chat box, the PPP framework, for example. So the PPP framework really focuses more, the way I see it, on the content that needs to be presented, practiced, and then produced by the students, right? And then it assumes a more teacher-centered sort of perspective, because I will present the content, the students will engage with that or not, because that's not part of the framework, right? And then we have to practice, and then they will have some more, a more student-centered stage in which they will produce something. But the Engage, Build, Consolidate framework goes beyond that, because what if you present something in a way that you thought was engaging, but it wasn't engaging because you don't understand how to engage your student's brain, right? What if you practiced a lot? You actually use drilling and less controlled, more controlled, and freer practice, and you follow that sequence, but then you didn't practice again because you thought, well, my lesson was done, I finished it, and then we now know that you have to sleep to consolidate declarative memory. So the PPP framework is really bound to the limits of that lesson, I think. And then that's why most of the books that we have nowadays, ELT materials, they are really based on that framework, on task-based framework, that it's really useful. And many people have learned using this, really. But I think we can maximize learning outcomes if we look at the PPP framework from an EBC perspective. If when we are presenting the topic of that lesson, we actually make sure that we are engaging our students. And when we are practicing less, more controlled, freer practice, that we go back to those activities later on, maybe 2 weeks, a month after that lesson, because it takes time to consolidate learning, right?
Yes, it's very interesting, Andre, what you are talking about, because when I first saw the title of your presentation, Engage, Build, Consolidate, what came to my mind that it's in a sense what we do, even sometimes even within a lesson. So first we engage students, whether it's a skills lesson, yep, or a language lesson. We set the scene, we generate interest in the topic. Yep. At least we are trying to do our very best to achieve that. And then we either engage students in the reading text or the listening text or writing or language learning, which can focus on learning grammar or vocabulary. So that's, yep, the building. So we are building on the engagement of the first part of the lesson, and also on students' previous knowledge or existing knowledge. And then we consolidate by having a communicative task where students, yes, have the opportunity to discuss what they read or listened to or wrote about. Or when it comes to systems lessons, we give them practice tasks. So more controlled and then less controlled one, exactly, as well. This kind of happens within a lesson as well. However, I do agree that spaced repetition is very important, because once the lesson comes to an end, that does not, as teaching happened, but I'm not sure how much of learning took place within that.
That's lesson. That's it. And since you mentioned spaced repetition, I just wanted to add something, and then I can answer Hooch's question. And really, it's about brain physiology. If you think about how we consolidate declarative memory, so memory of vocabulary, for example, concepts and ideas, it has a lot to do with a structure inside our brain called hippocampus. You cannot really see where the hippocampus is, but this here is the temporal lobe, which is on the side. It's very close to your ear, actually, on both sides of your head, right? Left and right hemisphere. And it's very close to, so I'm talking about the left temporal lobe here that has to do with language and processing and things like that. So if you could go maybe an inch in this direction, you would probably reach the hippocampus inside this structure. So we call it medial temporal lobe because it's in the middle of the temporal lobe. And it's a subcortical area because it's below the pink part of the brain, which is the cortex, right? So it's a subcortical area that is related to transferring, let's say, recently formed memories, short-term memories, to the long-term storage, which is all over the cortex, so to speak. It has, of course, many other functions, even spatial navigation, right? And the interesting thing is, it's pretty much like going to the gym, if you think about it. We are trying to strengthen a neuronal network in your brain, and it doesn't happen overnight, just because you were exposed to something once or twice. You have to keep coming at that thing, you have to actually go back to that thing, so that you are reinforcing those neuronal networks, pretty much like why you go to the gym 2-3 times a week for many months, years even, right? Because you're trying to strengthen your muscles the same way you're trying to strengthen your neuronal networks. And that's why it doesn't take just one lesson for you to remember something forever. And normally we have a self-assessment box at the end of each lesson. Now the can-dos, right? Now I can use modal verbs to express probability or something like that. And they are not able to assess that after one lesson. Maybe you can come back at the end of the semester, and then you look at the self-assessment box and then try to retrieve those things. And if you can retrieve those things, then you can check, tick that. Okay, now I can really do it, because it takes many, many months sometimes for you to consolidate something. And then Ruchi asked a question about, is there a better way to teach beginners? Is it okay to use L1? Yes, and this is something that goes against the hardliners of the communicative approach, right? That we are supposed to use the target language. We have to use the additional or second language, whatever you want to call it, at all times. And nowadays we're shifting from that idea, from that perspective, to a more bilingual context, or English as a lingua franca, for example, that doesn't really emphasize the use of that language all the time, but you can always go back to L1 to help your students understand. So from a working memory perspective, if you are helping your students build new knowledge and you are overwhelming their working memory capacities with the language that they're learning, so the target language. So here in Brazil, if I'm using only English to a group of students who are natives from Brazil, who were born here, they don't have that language. It's a basic level. It's a struggle. It's really overwhelming for their memories. It's actually, you're causing something called cognitive overload, because they're struggling all the time to try to understand what you're saying. And in a way that could be very negative, even though it's something we've been using for a very long time, because the communicative approach really is based on second language acquisition, which is very different if you look at how kids acquire language and how adults acquire language and actually learn language in a more conscious way. So maybe for a basic level, in which context you are, it doesn't matter which context you are, for a basic level, I think it's a very valid idea to use their L1 to make sure that they understand the meaning of certain phrases, to make sure that they understand chunks that are vital, they're fundamental for the lesson, because that will reduce the cognitive overload. They're not going to feel like, oh, I cannot do this. And this can actually have a very positive impact on their motivational levels for the lesson, because a lot of here in Brazil, I was teaching a B1, actually A1, A2 level a couple of years ago. We call it basic one. So the group was B1, but it was actually an A1 level. And many of those students, maybe 70% of those students, did not enroll for the next stage, because, and we did a satisfaction survey, and many of them said that they were overwhelmed with the teacher only speaking English in the classroom all the time. And even though we had interactive whiteboards and body language and everything, it's really hard for them to understand. And they were coming from their job at 6 p.m. So they had been working they were exhausted mentally, and then they had to listen to me talk to them for 1 hour and a half in English only. So some of them couldn't take it, and then they just gave up, you know. So if I had, and it was really a top down kind of policy that my school told me that I could not use Portuguese in the classroom. So I just worked like that. But if I could, you know, help those students who were maybe struggling, maybe they would have returned and actually continued their courses, right? But yeah, that's a great question. Another question here from the Q&A box is, how do the various approaches, methods that are taught in teacher training, such as the PPP or guided discovery, fit in the EBC framework? Again, that's a great question. And I think I've started answering that. I think that PPP, like I said, is really much more focused on the content, and assuming that most students are the same in a way, that they learn the same way, I'd say. Of course, it's not. I mean, it's more on that side of the spectrum. It's not an extreme. It's more on that side of the spectrum, because we had other approaches and methods before, like grammar translation and audiolingual, for example, that they were very much teacher-centered as well, even more than the PPP framework. But I think that the EBC framework really focuses on the learner and how the learner can benefit if you understand how their brain works and how we learn, you know, even if just basic principles. So that's why I think it's different, because some people have asked me, isn't engage related to present and then build to practice and then consolidate to production? Could be, but not necessarily, because maybe you're presenting something as fast as possible so that you can spend more time practicing. And then that's actually a wrong idea. It's not very effective, because you have to practice throughout a longer period of time, not just in the classroom. So maybe we should spend more time engaging the students to make sure that they are paying attention and committed to what we are doing, than actually practicing. But we should also help them practice throughout the month, for example. We can use a calendar, a schedule, just like the one I showed you, because that will give them maybe a better sense of purpose in terms of how and when they should practice more often. And they can use apps nowadays, right? There's so many apps that will deal with, you know, spaced repetition. You can actually program your own calendar on your phone to, you know, retrieve a couple of things that you saw in the classroom. You can use Anki, you can use Quizlet, for example, to do some active retrieval or cued retrieval. You look at the card, try to remember something, flip the card, check if you got it right. If you didn't, try again tomorrow, and just keep going, right? And I think that's why the EBC is much more effective in that sense, because we're looking at how learners actually learn, and we are using the science of learning to inform our decisions. That's why it should be more effective. And what is the main objective of the science of learning? Somebody asked here. So, well, the main objective of the science of learning is to answer the question, how can we learn more effectively? How do we learn? And look at the contributions of cognitive sciences, like neuroscience and cognitive psychology, but not just. I think really looking at the contributions of pedagogy, for example, andragogy, and you know, anything related to education, so that it kind of puts all of those contributions together in the same place for you to be better informed as a teacher, as an educator, as a policymaker, for you to maybe help students achieve better, more positive, more effective learning outcomes. And I think that's an incredible tool for us, if you think about it, about our profession. Because if you go back in time 50 years ago, or, you know, even 30 years ago, how much did we know about how the brain learns? How much did we know before we had neuroimaging technology, for example? Nowadays we can actually look at, you know, the brains, like inside the brains of our students. Of course they are done in a lab, in a very artificial environment. It's not the same as in the classroom, but if you can definitely extrapolate some of those findings to the classroom. And I think it makes sense for you to look at what the science is producing, reflect, try it out in the classroom, and then tell the neuroscientists, hey, what you told me to do is not working. So maybe do it again, try again, test again. And that's what the science of learning is trying to do, is really looking at the science, looking at the educational practices, and then merging those two different domains so that we can teach in a more evidence-informed way. That's what we're trying to do. So let me go to the chat box quickly here. And of course, if you want to talk, open your mic, raise your hand so that we can have a conversation. And if you see my cat, he's just curious, you know, he's walking all over. Yeah. Okay, so I have a question from, there's a question from Antonella in the chat box, in the question, the Q&A box. And then there's a very interesting question, I think it was Gabi who wrote in the chat box. So let me answer Antonella's question, then I'll go to Gabi's question. So does the teacher's learning style influence students' possibilities to learn effectively? So now you're probably gonna hate me a little bit, but first of all, learning styles is one of the things that the science of learning considers a neuromyth, right? Which means that after a lot of experimentation in a lab and you know, matching students according to their learning styles, and then checking if they learned best when presented, or you know, when they received input in that particular learning style. So we were able to, and there are many meta-analyses now, we were able to find that the learning styles theory is probably not something we should worry about so much. And for those of you who don't believe what I'm saying, I will share in the chat box my blog so that you can read about. So I try to revise this in a very systematic way, but you know, not using a lot of jargon so everybody can understand. And so if you're referring to how the teacher teaches in a way, like, you know, if they are enthusiastic, if they're more serious, if, yes, that might actually influence, because we've all been there as students, right? What teachers, who are the teachers you can still remember today? Because there was something about them and you really wanted to learn from them because they, I don't know, they did something, they made you interested in whatever they were teaching because of their personality, because of their enthusiasm, because of how they prepare the lessons. So there's definitely a personal element here in terms of how the teacher prepares and delivers their lesson. And it's really linked to their own personality. But I think when we understand the build stage of the EBC framework, we understand that we can use analogies and we can use body language, the mirror neuron system, so that our students can actually activate those neurons just by observing what we're doing, and that will help them internalize whatever we're trying to teach. We can work on those skills, you know, we can develop those skills. So one of the teachers that I will never forget, I had a literature teacher many years ago, and he would act out what he was reading in the classroom, and he was an inspiration to me, and that really made a difference, you know. I remember now many of the lessons I had with that teacher because of the way he taught the lesson. And maybe he never knew anything about the mirror neuron system, but he was definitely activating my mirror neurons without even knowing about that. And this is something that we can practice. We can, so if you are someone who doesn't really convey in the things that you do and the things that you say and how you do and say those things, you don't convey a lot of passion or enthusiasm, that it seems like you don't want to be there in the classroom or in this remote teaching environment, your students will not really be so interested, because, you know, why am I here if the teacher doesn't want to be here? You know, look at his or her face, right? So we have to convey that somehow. And again, of course, there are brilliant teachers who are extremely serious and they don't really use a lot of body language, but they're extremely eloquent. I've had those professors in my master's and undergrad course, and I was so interested in the topic that I learned very well. But people who are not interested in the topic, and then the teacher is not really doing anything to help that, so they are the ones who are struggling more probably. So that's why it's interesting for us to develop those skills, I think. Unhappy teachers, like Janice mentioned there in the chat box. And
Yeah,
then,
and
yes, please.
it's just what I wanted to add is that these things that you are talking about, like the approach response, like showing interest in what our students are saying, praising them, tapping into their curiosity,
Yes.
also reducing fearfulness and anxiety, building rapport. It's all like it depends on who learns where to become a teacher. But
Exactly.
if somebody does their SATA, for instance, it's included in classroom management, for instance.
Yep.
So they raise teachers' awareness, trainees' awareness of the way we should behave. So it's that once we grow in confidence and we can be a little bit beyond, get beyond focusing on just the subject material that we need to pass on to the students and become a little bit more self-aware, then, remember to smile and use gestures and body language.
That's it.
Move as well appropriately to the situation. So it's
perfect.
Evolved as well. And also, like the way I see this EBC framework is that it's not necessarily brand new. So it's not something that has never existed, but I think it makes it more holistic a little bit. So because, like, in a sense, we can say that every single human being is a teacher to the core of their being, whether they have a qualification about this or not. Like when I was little, it was my parents who did that, educating their child about how to behave when we were having, I don't know, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. But they taught me, how to behave when doing these things, or how to cross the road. They were the ones who taught me. However, like we can do the same thing at various levels. So those who become, let's say, teachers or educators in telling students, teaching young kids how to cross the road can definitely do a better job than my parents, who didn't have that educational background. And so I do believe that as this goes for everything, like motivation and commitment is very, very important. So when we want to become anything, let's talk about this speaking context. These are super important, but these like being motivated and committed may not be enough. And what I see in the EBC framework is getting that extra element of awareness, being aware of what I do and mostly why I should do that.
That's it. Being aware of how learning takes place, right? Yeah. So you can make better decisions. Yeah.
Exactly, because previously, like in my mind, like how or why is the involvement of science, like the science of psychology or biology, important in teaching languages, when even before the EBC framework, people managed to learn languages and have it.
Yes.
So how does it add to our life? But it's becoming aware of what's happening, how we function, how we are wired, and cater for that.
Yeah, and that's a very good observation. I think before the EBC framework, before the science of learning and mind-brain education, neuroeducation, all of those areas that are related, people learned and teachers taught, and I learned. I went to a very teacher-centered educational system here in Brazil, and I learned and I passed tests, and many of the things that and when I say I learned then for the purpose of maybe getting a grade or something like that. So if you ask me many things about my history lessons, many years ago, I don't remember much. I don't remember much. If you think about physics and all the formulas and everything, I can't remember all of them, but probably not even half of the things that I was learning at the time. So that's not learning per se, that's the thing. There's a difference between performance and learning. And American psychologist Robert Bjork talks about that. So in a language lesson, it's different because you're going to have to use that as a tool to achieve something. So if you're going to an English class anywhere in the world, you're there because you want to be able to communicate with people, which is completely different from learning about plates tectonic, for example, in your geography classes, because maybe if you're never going to study that in your undergrad course, or maybe you will never use that again in your life, right? Maybe just when you're watching National Geographic on TV or something like that. But again, when you are in a language lesson, the things that you're learning there, they are going to be applied somehow in your real life, in your daily life context, right? So that's why what the EBC framework does and the science of learning does is basically systematize the things that were kind of scattered all over. They were just coming from different areas, coming from different practices and things that we did as teachers because we were taught that way. And then we started questioning those things. And then the science of learning is looking at all of those contributions, validating through the scientific method, and telling us what actually works better and what doesn't work so well. So we drop them. If it doesn't work, just move on, try something else. And there's many things. That's what the science of learning does. There are many things that don't work very well, and we keep using them because we were taught that way. They're just traditional. They're part of a certain, status quo or a zeitgeist of educational literature. If you think about how we've been teaching for millennia, even, let's say at least 250 years or 300 years with the Industrial Revolution, it was really about making sure that we had basic knowledge of maths and languages to read signs, but just really read instructions and obey instructions. It wasn't really about critical thinking, right? And it's also very much based on the idea that knowledge was scarce, information was hard to retrieve. Nowadays, that's not the scenario anymore. We can retrieve information from anything, anywhere in the world using our phones. So why do we have to memorize that if it's just there for us? The problem is, what do we do with that information? But with English, you still have to memorize vocabulary. You still have to have that knowledge, right? Because you're not going to check your phone all the time you don't remember a word. So there are some elements that work. I mean, some of the old-fashioned ways we've been teaching with drilling, which is great, but maybe we're overdoing it or doing it too much on the same day. So they work, really, they do work. I'm not saying we have to completely revolutionize what we've been doing in the classroom, because many of the things we are doing in the classroom are actually quite useful and effective. But if we fine-tune what we are doing in the classroom in a way that it's more aligned with what the science is telling us, I think then we can get incredible results, from our students in terms of their achievement. And that's exactly, I think, one of the questions here, if I can answer, Gabby. Yes, neuro-linguistic programming, right, Gabby? So this is something that is not really well accepted, let's say, in the neuroscientific community, because it takes a lot of assumptions that are not really falsifiable, let's say. We cannot really test them. So, for example, to give you an illustration, Tony Robbins, right, so, a neuro-linguistic programmer or a coach who has made millions from, selling books and workshops and everything. One of the the fundamental messages in his lectures is that you go to his workshop for a couple of hours, and it doesn't matter what problem you're going through, he's going to make you think the right words. And because thought and language are intertwined, and if you look at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, for example, that your language will shape your thoughts, the things you can think of. So if I change the language of your brain, the things that you can think of, or how you look at things in your brain, that will change your reality. The problem is, it's not as simple, because then maybe those people, they actually have to go to therapy. Some of those people, they might have a severe case of depression, and they have to take medicine to actually increase the reuptake of dopamine, because it's a physiological thing happening in the brain. It's not just by changing the way you think of the world. So we have to be extremely careful with what we propagate. Some of the ideas are we can test them, and they might actually offer something interesting. But I think the underlying principle of neuro-linguistic programming might actually be considered pseudoscientific by many neuroscientists, you know? So, but again, yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, sorry, Andre, that it's what you were talking about is also called mental housekeeping.
Yeah.
Changing the words so that it could catch up with the reality I want to manifest. And there was one more thing I wanted to add, is that it also goes back to the fact that you mentioned in your presentation that every brain of that, we have the uniqueness of our brain, but we also have our own life experience as well. So, you know, he's like Tony Robbins, you were talking about his method, for instance, may not work, will not work for everyone. So
exactly. Yeah.
However, living in contrast, this idea also goes a little bit back to what you said previous. There's an advantage to living in contrast, I think, because we can see what's not working, and we can learn from that. We can just tailor those and make changes to that.
That's being metacognitive. You know, if you're trying out different things and checking what works best for you, and of course, always trying to surpass your cognitive biases, because that's the thing. You might think that what's working is what you're doing is actually working for you, but it might not be working. So I think that's the purpose of the science of learning, to give you evidence so that you can make better informed decisions on how we learn. And many people believe that if I do it like this, then I learn better. And then, you know, that goes hand in hand with the idea of learning styles or learning preferences. But maybe you don't do it better. Maybe it's just you don't learn better from doing that. Maybe it's just a cognitive bias, because you are really, it's performance versus learning. If you do something and then you get a great, awesome mark on a test, you might actually be under the influence of, oh, I did learn well, but then if I apply the same test a week later, you don't remember half of it. So you haven't learned, because learning takes time. So you're really reflecting on the results of the things you're doing from your many cognitive biases. There are nearly 200 categorized and you know, cognitive biases in psychology. So we cannot really trust our own perceptions all the time, because it's not objective, you know, it cannot be tested many times. But again, we have to learn how to learn, and that's being metacognitive. Yeah. So there's a question that Gabi asked some time ago that I think I should answer. So let's see if I can find it in the chat box. I was going to, here. So wouldn't you say that when only using L2 in teaching and learning, students are more likely to also develop their conceptual understanding of things, as opposed to just using L1 concepts in L2, just like spaced repetition that assumes that applying new knowledge in new situations helps to develop new associations and meaning. Yeah, this is, I think, if I got it right, concepts are stored regardless of language, you know, if you think about it. That's one of the principles of bilingualism. So I think Milady's Gort, University of Boulder in the USA, Colorado, Boulder, has a very interesting talk about that. So you can just, search on YouTube, UC Boulder bilingualism, and I'm pretty sure you're going to find that video. And if you check, for example, who has more vocabulary, who has a larger uh, repertoire in their brains, monolinguals or bilinguals. And then you'll see that monolinguals will normally outperform bilinguals because they can more easily access lexicon in a way, words basically. But then if you look at the conceptual vocabulary, so if you take, let's say, a bilingual who speaks Portuguese and English, and you get a Native American, I mean, a person born in the USA who speaks only English, and you compare the results, the monolingual from the USA will probably know more words in English than the bilingual who speaks both English and Portuguese. But if you transform those words into concepts that could come either in L1 or L2, then bilinguals will often outperform monolinguals because concepts are not stored as language in the brain necessarily. It's almost like we have this language for concepts that gets translated to whatever language we're using when we have to speak or use that language, right? So bilingualism actually will reinforce literacy in L1, So it doesn't really matter that much for very young learners if you're using just English or just their native language, because they will become bilingual either way, really. We've seen that happen all the time. And for adults and teenagers, it's really useful for you to reduce the cognitive overload. So whenever you really have, instead of spending 5 minutes trying to explain what something is in English, you can actually just tell them in their L1, and then you move on, and then you reduce the cognitive load, and then you can speak most of the lesson in English because that's the language you're teaching. But maybe you can use 20% of the lesson to use words in their own language because that will help them improve their linguistic repertoire, right? And that is something that the communicative approach doesn't like very much.